I would like to welcome Louis Jacob, artist, curator, writer. We've worked together for a long time. We've co-curated this project, and he's going to speak to more of the why. Why now? Why here?
Thanks, Barbara. Thank you. It's really wonderful to see you here, packed house. It's really wonderful. Welcome. And just a special welcome of the folks that are coming here from outside of Toronto and our guests from England, from Germany. Welcome all of you. So I will pick up some of the threads that Barbara started to outline for us and explore a couple of questions. Why this conference? Why now? I'll start with some anecdotes. A few years ago, the Power Plant presented an exhibition titled, "If We Can't Get It Together, Artists Rethinking the Malfunction of Communities." I was asked to write an essay for the catalog, and I decided to start with the following words. I wrote, "Historical continuity is the Achilles heel of Toronto art making." In that text, I try to describe what I felt was an absence in the city's culture of a sense of historical continuity. I was concerned about the effect that this inability to connect the dots has on artistic practice. Exhibition follows exhibition, artist follows artist, decade follows decade, and quickly each of these would sink into our collective amnesia, into the black hole of cultural disregard. I felt that this situation amounted to something like a lack of language, the absence of a shared context that serves as a foundation that a community of people can take for granted in order to build upon this foundation, as well as to contest it, play with it, distort it, and challenge it. Artists, I believe, normally produce their work with a degree of confidence that their audiences share some common set of local references that serves to ground interpretations of their work. So speaking as an artist then, I started to ask, how is it possible to work in a place that lacked its own language? Of course, it's not like we don't have any language at all. The problem was that the cultural languages at our disposal in places like Toronto typically serve to make us subservient. Back in 2009, when I wrote that text, I had just finished teaching a series of courses at the University of Guelph and here at U of T. As a sessional teacher, I was struck by how fascinated students seemed to be by what they heard was happening in places like Berlin, New York, London, and simultaneously by how very little they knew about what was happening in their own backyards. This predicament in the classroom reminds me of Penny Cousineau-Levine's book, Faking Death, Canadian Art, Photography, and the Canadian Imagination. In that book, she describes talking to her students at a photo history course that she was teaching in Montreal. Students who, as she noted, were themselves to become the next generation of Canadian photographers. This is what she wrote. When shown Canadian photographs alongside those made in Britain, the US, and elsewhere, whether documentary photographs, or portraits, or landscapes, the almost universal response of these students was that they could see nothing in these images, that there was nothing there. The fact that these students had absolutely no sense of the significance of the products of their own people, and hence, by extrapolation of their own artistic work, that they could look forward only to making images they themselves would view as valueless, and that would fall invisible into a critical void, all of this was enough to make me call into question what I was doing as a teacher. So her students, as well as my own, were inquisitive and invested in the work of fellow artists. But it seemed only as long as those artists represented places, people, and events that did not reflect the realities that these students experienced directly in their own lives. Reality, it seemed, was something that for these students, and in my experience, for many practicing artists and collectors here, reality is something that exists over there, but seldom here. So speaking as a teacher then, I asked, how is it possible for us to educate each other in such a colonized context? Fortunately, a lot of critical work has been done that provides us with conceptual tools to tackle these questions. As Cousineau-Levine herself observed, concerning Canadian photography, terms like nothing, words having to do with lack and invisibility, concepts like no history, would not have impressed me so deeply had they not resonated with certain precepts taking form within feminism at the time. Carol P. Christ has pointed out, for instance, that the ordinary experience of women in patriarchy is akin to the experience of nothingness, the nothingness they know as a lack of self, lack of power, and lack of value for women in a male-centered world. So she notes that feminist writers like Carol P. Christ, post-colonial authors like Edward Said, and many others have developed ways to discuss these conditions of lack, absence, and disregard that are useful in order to understand the things I feel I was experiencing here in the city. And as a queer person, I wondered if there was something of the proverbial closet at play in being an artist here. If we understand the closet as the existential situation of being constantly surrounded by images, words, and social customs that exclude your own experience of reality. The closet as the existential problem of having to piece together your own self-image when the only reference points available to you are precisely those that render you invisible. Much like the queer teenager who's always falling in love with their straight folks, I imagine that I was part of a community hopelessly in love with others, the exciting art capitals of the world as we read about them in magazines and vicariously experience them traveling to art fairs. We were in love with others who would not always reciprocate our love. I began to keep an eye out and talk to people around me. As a learner then, eager to understand, I started asking, how did my fellow artists in Toronto, along with fellow curators, writers, and historians in the city, deal with these questions that were so perplexing? Barbara Fisher and I decided to convene this conference with a belief that each of our panelists, lecturers, and presenters, as well as each of you, holds a piece of the puzzle. We welcome you here with a conviction that as we share our stories, debate their significance, and glimpse narratives not yet told, a larger picture will emerge. An image, or a series of complementary and competing images of this place we call Toronto. But why now? Since first posing these questions 6 years ago, I've begun to see things differently. What if this so-called absence of history was actually one of the ways we conduct history in the city? Perhaps by way of what John Davies calls gossip, or by way of what Robert Fillieux calls a whispered art history. And what if this lack of language was itself a way of speaking in tongues? Even while writing back in 2009, I acknowledged that the situation I was describing had already begun to change. Barbara had organized the touring exhibition General Idea Editions in 2003. Philip Monk had initiated a series of restaged Toronto exhibitions at AGYU, beginning with his living retrospective of Fastworm storefront projects in 2007. And that same year, John Davies had curated an important retrospective of the video work of Colin Campbell for Oakville Galleries. Many other initiatives since that time, and countless others before then, persuasively demonstrate that narratives of local history abound. This conference today is itself a piece of an even larger puzzle. We live at a moment of, enthusiastic curiosity about this city. If there was something I realized during Rob Ford's chaotic years as mayor, it was the necessity to explore this city and its culture beyond the narrow limits of my familiar circles. Toronto is not quite what it was even a few years ago. Recently, several important initiatives have helped to develop a new sense of curiosity and commitment to our own urban and cultural environment. Groups like the Toronto Friends of the Visual Arts, founded in 1998, and Partners in Art, founded in 2002, have developed volunteer-driven and collective structures of philanthropy to provide support for the local arts ecosystem. Spacing magazine, launched in 2003 to explore urban issues in Toronto, and has since then expanded to become a major cross-Canada network in print and online. Coach House Books published Utopia, Towards a New Toronto in 2005, and the book has become an important touchstone, followed by an ambitious roster of Toronto-centered publications, The State of the Arts, Living with Culture in Toronto in 2006, Greentopia, Towards a Sustainable Toronto in 2007, HTO, Toronto's Water from Lake Iroquois to Lost Rivers to Low-Flow Toilets in 2008, The Edible City, Toronto's Food from Farm to Fork in 2009, and Local Motion, The Art of Civic Engagement in Toronto in 2010. The Aboriginal Curatorial Collective came together in 2005 to develop the discourse of Aboriginal curators and scholars within the discipline of Aboriginal arts in Canada. 4 years ago, the collective convened the conference Revisioning the Indians of Canada Pavilion, Azekewada, Let Us Look Back, in partnership with the Aboriginal Visual Culture Program at Oakhead University, nurturing an influential network of Aboriginal curators across the country. Jane's Walk, a series of neighborhood walking tours led by volunteers and named after urban activist and writer Jane Jacobs, are held annually during the first weekend in May to coincide with her birthday. Since its inception in Toronto in 2007, Jane's Walk has spread around the world to 134 cities across 6 continents. FAG, the Feminist Art Gallery, was founded in 2010 as a political hub of queer and feminist cultural production to build community and grow sustainable feminist and queer art. This artist-run project has developed an innovative funding model, what they call a web of matronage, of supportive individuals and institutions that renders the gallery independent from government and corporate funders. The Art Canada Institute is an invaluable research organization founded in Toronto 3 years ago that promotes the study of Canadian art history by producing beautifully designed ebooks written in both French and English and disseminating them online within Canada and internationally. So these are but a few examples, but they are highly significant in tracing a cultural shift that is happening in the city, a shift towards collective local memory. The title of this conference, This is Paradise, Art and Artists in Toronto, like the title of the exhibition, This is Paradise, Place as a State of Mind, curated by Ray Johnson and Herb Tukey and presented at MoCA in 2011, both refer to a painting by artist Tom Dean. This painting was created for display in the dimly lit and beer-fueled spaces of the Cameron House on Queen Street West. I believe that the paradise these various projects refer to is not the iconic image of Toronto with its high-rise towers, but rather paradise refers to the microbial beehive quality of culture in the city, so different from the superstar model in other places. So as we gather here in the lavishly detailed and well-illuminated spaces of Hart House at the University of Toronto, it remains important to bear in mind that the translations and even the distortions that can happen as we apply the language of history with a capital H to narrate histories born in the gossipy social spaces where culture is originally created. So there is a real risk of misrepresentation involved in what we're about to do today and in the days to come. But there are also reasons to believe that our artistic communities in Toronto, embodied by all of you, are resilient and strong enough for the task. The effort to connect the dots is, I think, worth the risk of misrepresenting this paradise, as we strive to sketch a richer, more complex, more contradictory picture of this place we call home.